Good evening and welcome back. Grab yourself a nice cup of tea and relax because we're going to go time traveling back to 1858 where Paul Morphy is commentating on the 1834 match between Bourdonnais and McDonnell. This match is best of 21 games, but draws are not counted, so there could be more than 21 games in this match. And Bourdonnais has the white pieces and McDonnell has the black pieces, and we shall proceed. So Bourdonnais opens with e4. McDonnell replies e5, and Bourdonnais continues with d4. And Morphy says here, this move constitutes the opening known as the centre gambit. Although not as powerful as the classical move of knight to f3, it may occasionally be adopted for variety's sake. So d4 was played. And the game continues. The pawn captures, and now Bourdonnais plays knight to f3. And McDonnell follows this up with c5. Morphy comments. He says that bishop to b4 with check is here recommended by most authors as the best play at black's command. Without being disposed to combat this opinion, we think that they have unjustly condemned this move in the text, c5, which, with the best afterplay on both sides, leads to a game where the first player's advantage is by no means as marked as would be inferred from their criticisms. So Paul from Morphy says this is fine and don't worry about it. And the game continues with bishop to c4. And Morphy says, white may also move here, c3. A move strangely enough overlooked by the leading authorities, who makes the second player commit the obvious error of capturing the pawn. Okay, so we go back to bishop to c4. And McDonnell follows this with knight to c6. And then Bourdonnais plays now c3. And McDonnell plays queen to f6. And Morphy's comment on this is that McDonnell manifested great partiality for this sortie of the queen in the Scotch gambit. In the above position, it is probably the best play on the board. However, with the benefit of 21st century technology, my computer says that knight to f6 is actually a far better move because it retains equality in the game between the two positions. So an example line might be pawn captures, white castles. The knight captures the pawn, and now the rook pins the knight against the king. So black pushes his pawn to d5. Now white captures the pawn with the bishop, and the queen takes the bishop back. This isn't as bad as it immediately looks because we have now knight to c3, attacking the queen and attacking the pinned knight. This pawn cannot take the knight back because the black piece, the black queen would immediately be lost. So the black queen will retreat and we can capture back our piece for the bishop with check. So that's an example line of maintaining equality that the engine recommended, instead of the actual move that was played, queen to f6. And so the game continues. White now castles. We have d6, pawn captures again, and now knight to g5. Morphy says, the objection to this course is that it enables black to retain his pawn, whereas by bishop to b5, white would immediately have regained it and remained with a somewhat superior position. And we can make up a line here to demonstrate this. Black might try to chase away the bishop with the pawn. The bishop can capture with check. The pawn takes back. And now there's only one defender, the queen, on this pawn against the two attackers. So, as Morphy says, white can regain his pawn. So we'll go back to the main line. Knight to g5. And the game continues. Black plays knight to h6. We have f4, bishop to e7, and the pawn is pushed to e5, attacking the queen. So the queen moves out the way. And the pawn captures the pawn on d6, and black recaptures with the queen. And now we have knight to a3. So the engine doesn't like this very much. The engine thinks that knight to d2 is better, but this is 1834. We have no engine, so knight to a3. The game continues. Black castles. Bishop comes back to d3. Bishop to f5, attacking the bishop. And now the knight comes in to attack the queen with knight to c4. And again, the queen moves back to g6. And it's doubling up here on the white bishop that only has one defender. But Bourdonnais doesn't mind. He brings his knight back to f3. The black bishop catches the white bishop, and Bourdonnais responds with knight on the c-file to e5. Now he's attacking the black knight, the black queen, and the black bishop here. And McDonnell responds by advancing his bishop to attack the white queen. So Morphy says here, black relying upon his surplus pawn. I'll start that again. Black relying upon his surplus pawn plays thus in order to compel an exchange of queens. But as the progress of the game sufficiently proves, the result is an amelioration of his adversary's position, and ultimately a drawn battle. Had he instead first captured knight with knight, and then played his queen to f5, his superiority in force and position would, we think, have enabled him to score the game. And from this point, as we know from his editor, Morphy is incorrigibly lazy, so he leaves about 30 moves without a comment. So we shall just proceed, and we'll see how we get on. We might make a couple of comments on engine positions. Mostly from here, the game is an equal game until a couple of certain points that we'll get to. So the game continues. Bourdonnais captures the queen, and McDonnell captures the queen back. And we have knight captures bishop with check, so black of course captures back, and white captures the bishop. Play continues, the knight comes forward, the knight's attacked by g4, and of course the McDonnell wants to attack, so he brings the knight up to e3. And Bourdonnais captures, and the pawn captures back. Now this pawn is looking quite dangerous. It's getting quite close to the other side, so Bourdonnais will have to do something about this. But not straight away. He moves the rook to d7 on the 7th rank, and Bourdonnais has to defend the knight, so he does so. And Bourdonnais brings in the white, brings in his other rook to sit in front of the pawn and keep an eye on it. The knight comes to g6, and Bourdonnais attacks it with another pawn push, and so McDonnell, not being one to back off, wants to advance, so here he comes with his knight up to f4. The rook comes back to chase it away, but it only comes closer. And this is check, so the king has to move, and McDonnell brings his knight into this nice outpost on f2. Now, the next move is where this position is interesting, but Morphy doesn't commentate. Bourdonnais moves to c4, and this actually loses the game. We'll see how McDonnell deals with this. So he brings the rook across to d8, which is fine. At this point, Bourdonnais really needs to play rook to e2, otherwise McDonnell is going to have too much force behind this pawn, and it's going to be a massive danger. And so he responds with h3, which continues to leave him in a losing position. McDonnell capitalizes on this by not winning the game. Instead, he pushes to h6. What he should have done, according to the engine, was knight to d3. And this attacks the rook, so the rook has to move and protect the pawn. And McDonnell might have done a pawn push and started chasing the rook. The rook may have gone back to the 7th rank, and McDonnell would have continued to push the pawns. There's not much that Bourdonnais can do now. He's fighting a losing battle, and you'll see that this black pawn is getting ever closer and the forces are building up behind it. So this is a winning position for McDonnell. But he didn't do that. He decided to push his pawn to h6. And now, finally, Bourdonnais plays rook to e2. And we're back to a drawn game. And we have b5, chasing away the rook. And we have an exchange of rooks. And a push of the pawn on the side there. The king comes closer to the center of the board, which is what you want to do during an endgame. And we have knight captures on h3. Excuse me, we have the rook captures the pawn. The knight attacks the king with check. The king moves, and we have an exchange of rooks. The pawns get pushed some more. We have an exchange of more of the pawns off of the board. Knight to c6 and knight to e6. The king goes up and dominates the center of the board on e4. And finally McDonnell gets his black king moving. We have king to e5 from McDonnell, and from Bourdonnais, and McDonnell continues to push his pawns. We have captures and captures, and the king goes over to chase the pawn because he's worried about this passed pawn getting across to the other side, of course. The black knight goes over to c7, and Bourdonnais starts his pawns moving. King to e8, a4, captures and captures, and McDonnell brings his knight forward to d5, and the king starts going after the pawn. Knight to e7, and knight to b8. And finally, Morphy is woken up, and he wants to commentate from here. He says that white, as an examination of the position will satisfy the student, might equally have drawn by exchanging knights. So let's see what he means by this. He means capturing here. The king captures back, and if we play this game through, white captures the pawn, black goes over to catch the white pawn, and white comes over to try to force the draw. And as you can see, he makes it just in time, and there's nothing black can do now to stop white from drawing the game. He can just push the pawn across, and we'll eventually see that it's a stalemate. Either black moves here and white's got no move, but he's not in check, so that's stalemate, or black has to move the king to the side, and then he'll just lose the pawn, and it's a stalemate. So let's wind back to where Morphy said the exchange was possible. But instead, b8 was played, so we'll carry on from here. McDonnell pushes the pawn, knight to a6, knight to g6, and the king captures the pawn. And again, Morphy is wide awake now, he's commentating. He says that here again, a different course would have brought about the same result. The knight might have been captured and a draw secured. Thus. And Morphy doesn't say how the draw is secured, so we'll have to play for him. So the black pawn could be pushed, and the knight has to race over to get there in time to stop it from reaching the other side. And then the black king will head towards the white pawn, and the white king will head towards the black pawn. And they shall both capture. And now there's one black pawn left on the table for McDonnell, but the problem for black is that the white knight is able to arrive in the circuit that will stop the white being able to stop the pawn being able to get to the other side. So I shall show you how this works. If the knight can get to one of these squares in time, it's a drawn game. So here he goes into the circuit now, and now no matter where black goes, he's not going to be able to avoid the checks and forks, and he can just cycle around like this, and black won't be able to advance far enough to get the pawn across. This is check. This is check again. Black goes back, and we can even bring the white king closer. No matter what black does, he can't get out of this. Even if he pushes the pawn now, he's walking straight into a fork, and the pawn is gone, and that's another stalemate. So rewinding back to where Morphy commentated. In the actual game, and like anybody would do, I would expect, the king captures the pawn, and it's a check, and the white has to move. Check again, white king has to move. Black king starts moving towards the center, the white king comes over, the knight moves out of the way, and it's at this point that it appears that a draw was agreed to by the two gentlemen. And so that's it. That was the first game of the first match. And thank you for joining me, and I'll see you again for the second game of the first match.